Our first guest has spent 10 years of her life writing a book that's all about people who are reputedly trying to take down government in one way or another, and this time by maybe, a little incendiary device or a little bomb. You have a new book. This is Dr. Ann Larabee, and she's at the English department of Michigan State University, and her new book is called Wrong Hands. And who are the people who have wrong hands?
Well, Bonnie, the book is about popular weapons manuals. Listeners might know them more as anarchist cookbooks.
Yes.
Or bomb-making manuals. They're books that teach readers how to make bombs and other kinds of weapons and devices. Usually they have some kind of political purpose. They may make statements against government along with giving these kinds of instructions. And they've been around for a long time. My book starts in the late 19th century and moves up to the present. And so various radical groups over the course of American history have written these kinds of manuals, often just to provoke the government without ever even maybe intending to use them.
What's some examples, Ann?
Well, the classic is the Anarchist Cookbook, which was written in 1970. Well, it was published in 1971. Lyle Stewart, and he had run-ins with the government before he published the Anarchist Cookbook. There was a subcommittee on investigations, which called him before them to testify on his publication of pro-Cuban books. So when he published the Anarchist Cookbook, that same committee had just done a series, 2 days of hearings on bomb-making manuals to see if they could censor them. And even though the subcommittee decided not to, and they couldn't censor them because we have free speech protections, they irritated a lot of people in the country. And so Lyle Stewart published the Anarchist Cookbook. Now, the Anarchist Cookbook was written by William Powell, who was a 19-year-old student at a liberal arts college in Vermont. And he just compiled this. He went to the library and just compiled these recipes from chemistry textbooks and the like. But later, he repudiated the manual. But because he didn't own the copyright, he couldn't get the publisher to stop publishing the Anarchist Cookbook.
Well, who would own copyright? When it's a compilation of government things that are in the public domain, government manuals are in the public domain, is there really a copyright in that?
Yeah, well, once it was compiled and he had rewritten it, and Lyle Stewart had published it, then it became the property of Lyle Stewart. And then Lyle Stewart sold the intellectual property to various publishers. I mean, there's a stream of publishers that have published the Anarchist Cookbook, and every time it goes to a new publisher, William Powell begged them to stop publishing this, and they just keep on doing it. And it's sold a lot of copies. Yeah. It's very popular.
Is he accredited?
William Powell?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we've seen too, you used to see it back in the 60s and 70s. I used to get the LA Free Press, and there would be the little classified ads in the back, and you could get your copy of the Anarchist Cookbook there. That was where they were selling them. Has it been tied specifically to famous incidents we might think about, the bombing in Greenwich Village by the Weathermen, where their stuff went up before they got a chance to use it? Was that tied directly?
Yeah, well, actually, the Weather Underground, they pointed to the DuPont's Blaster's Handbook, which was published by the DuPont Corporation. And the Anarchist Cookbook has long been known to have not very useful information. However, it's been tied. I found dozens of court cases where the Anarchist Cookbook was entered into evidence against various persons, enemies of the state, really, when they even though the Anarchist Cookbook could never be tied to any actual bomb making, it was used to, because it had the word anarchist in it, because it could be used to paint a picture of defendants.
Did you come across the one that was for guerrilla warfare? I can't think of the title of it now.
The Biddy Manual, the Marigal, yes, and that was entered. The subcommittee on investigations in the 70s had that. They read it. They had a number of those kinds of works that they read aloud. 150 Questions for the Guerrilla by Alberto Bayo, who trained Castro's freedom fighters, was the one they really wanted to feature because they wanted to connect the New Left with with Castro. So.
It was fascinating because Ann gave an hour-long talk for the history department. She kicked off a series here, and I was able to attend that, and there is a video of that that's up, and that's quite interesting because this goes way back. And I think when we first got started, government was a little bit cavalier about shutting some of these people off, but over time, as we began to really sort of revere our free speech freedoms, there was a sort of pride in the fact that we didn't try to get rid of the Anarchist Cookbook. But what climate do you think we're in now in this post 9/11 world?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting the levels in which these texts appear. For example, in the hearings on bomb-making manuals, they decided they couldn't censor them, and the federal government can't really just outright censor bomb-making manuals, even though in England, under the Terrorism Act, you can be arrested and imprisoned for owning the Anarchist Cookbook.
Just for having it.
Just for having it, if the police don't like you. But here, we've been protected. There is a law now on the books that forbids teaching the use of explosives for use in a federal crime. So there's that clause that has to be used in a crime, intended for use in a crime. But it's being used in kind of frightening ways. For example, in 2000, Sherman Austin, who was an anti-globalization activist, was arrested for posting a link to a bomb-making manual on his webpage. And he was also accused of hacking as well, but he ended up plea bargaining, and I think he served a year in prison or something like that. But they did use this law just against him just for posting a link. Yeah. But interestingly, there was a computer scientist who posted the exact same link on a webpage at a university to kind of provoke the government to see if, would they go after him, a computer scientist, or are they just going after anti-globalization activists? And of course, nothing was done about him. So there are interesting tests going on of this.
That is that right hands, wrong hands kind of idea.
Exactly.
That we could trust a researcher and an academic and a member of the sort of intellectual elite, but we can't trust some outsider whose motives might be dubious.
Yeah, and there's another law, material support for terrorist organizations. And there was a young guy, he was a pharmacist, and he participated on a Salafi jihadist forum. And his name was Tarek Mehanna, and he translated a document that was alleged to be from Al-Qaeda. And even though the evidence actually linking him to Al-Qaeda was so scanty as to be almost non-existent, he did get 8 years in prison for translating that document.
Oh, I hadn't heard about that. Mm-hmm. Where did you do most of your research?
Most of my research was in appeals court cases. So I was looking at where these manuals appeared in court records. I wrote a chapter on Earth First, which was the environmental organization, and I went and did archival research in David Foreman's papers in Denver. And then there's historical research from the 19th century that's just kind of standard historical research.
Well, this isn't your first bomb book.
Yeah, right.
You've been to the rodeo.
Right? Yes,
if you hear ticking coming out of Ann's purse,
some people write about what they love, and I write about what I fear.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. One of your books was on Wall Street, right?
No, it was on the Dynamite Fiend. It was
that's right.
Yeah, it was a guy who had an insurance scam to blow up passenger ships crossing the Atlantic, but he was a Confederate agent who learned how to make bombs during the war. So.
Now, did you discover in your research that a lot of these bombs go terribly wrong and blow up the bomb maker?
Yeah, in fact, these manuals are not very effective.
No.
They're not very useful. The one that's been recently useful is the Boston Marathon bombers used Inspire's directions for making a pressure cooker bomb, but they had photograph after photograph of exactly how to do it.
Right. So
that wasn't just reading. Most of these are just textual. It's only recently that we have these photographic, these quite graphic kinds of bomb making manuals. But for the most part, these are not useful at all. Effective bombers learn how to do it from say, being educated in engineering, or they have
Or they go into
have
the
chemical-
military.
In the
or they go in the
military.
military, right? So they
Yeah.
get some kind of training that allows them to do it, and that's the most effective way. There are just so many cases of people blowing themselves up trying to make a bomb. It's not as easy as it looks, even a quite
Diana
primitive.
Oten, wasn't it?
Yeah, right.
who blew herself up in the.
I was there the day after,
Oh, were you really?
right across the street. They didn't
Whoa.
even block the street off. It was a
Wow.
huge hole.
Oh my
I
goodness.
mean, I didn't even know that's where it was in New York. I just happened to be across the street. And I went, whoa!
Well, you look at
Yeah.
Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold out in Columbine, and had they been successful with the bombs they built, there would have been far more carnage than there was. But apparently, I think they went to the Jolly Roger site. Was that right? Is that the one they were using?
Well, the propane bomb that they used,
Yeah.
it was a propane. I can't find it in any record from that
Really?
time. I don't know how they came up with that. They may have invented it, but anyway, it's not a good. It was not a good. Fortunately, thankfully, they didn't go off.
Yeah.
Well, I had two of them, and they didn't go off.
When I was a teenager, a young teenager, we made rockets, which are basically bombs that go somewhere.
Yeah.
And we
They're the right hands guys.
yeah, it was the right stuff. Or Rocket Boy, do you remember that book?
Yeah.
Rocket Boy, I think it was, or Rocket Boys. It went well often, and then one time it didn't, and it was third-degree burns on someone.
Yeah.
I mean, making things that blow up is barely a science.
There's a huge amount of risk.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, we found out.
yeah, I have actually one of the chapters of my book is about how that Cold War experimentation kids did with rocket science, and it was the same kind of technology.
Yes.
And a lot of boys were experimenting, and a son of the Brazilian attaché was killed trying to make these kinds of bombs in his garage. But then, right after that, all of this stuff gets uploaded onto the internet. Same
Right.
kinds of kids, who then they're fascinated by pyrotechny and anarchy, and so they start copying things like the Anarchist Cookbook onto the internet.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ, here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Dr. Ann Larabee about her book, Wrong Hands. And one of the things that I think that's so interesting is there's so much mistaken information surrounding so many of these cases. I mean, I think it was Salon Magazine that did the retrospective on the Columbine killers, and they weren't part of the Trenchcoat Mafia. All sorts of lore gets in, and these stories get bandied about. The same thing happens with a lot of these various cases. Even when you talked the other day, somebody, when you were mentioning Earth First, talked about how well they harmed so many people with tree spiking and injured so many loggers, and that's more or less lore, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, there was only one case of a worker in a sawmill who was putting a tree through the mill, and the saw broke, and his face was cut. But that's the only incident. And it's not clear what exactly happened. That's a disputed case. It's not clear whether that was a tree spike that was hit and caused that injury. But yeah, there is a lore about it. In some ways, I think that urban legends about Anarchist Cookbook
Yeah.
saying, oh, they're really dangerous, are good. They kind of prevent maybe experimentation that might be quite harmful. So I actually like urban legends about these books, that
So we
they're
should
more
make up
dangerous
some
than
new
they
one.
are. Yeah.
You will
Maybe we
blow
should keep
yourself
quiet.
up.
Yeah, you will blow. Yeah, in fact, William Buckley, right after the Anarchist Cookbook was published, he said, oh, this was all written by the FBI.
Oh, yes. I had a job back when I was working with the Critical Incident Analysis Group. Our job was to look at some of the early, sort of the precursor, the militia people, and follow some of the forums. And we would see that there were lots of discussions of those kinds of weapons on there. And the government has always wanted to find out what these groups are up to. What kind of surveillance do they just pretty much know everything? I mean, is it with the NSA? Is the idea that you're going to keep your information private a lost cause?
In terms of the
You go to the
information
internet,
that's
you
circulating on
download
the-
something. I
Well,
mean,
they
I'm
know.
assuming with the surveillance
Oh
state.
yeah,
they know.
I would like to have my FBI file, because
How did you
I've
do the
donated
research without
dozens
getting on
of
their
things.
list?
Yeah, I'm sure I probably have. I think I should probably,
Well, I
order my
remember
file and see.
early in internet book sales, there were people, if you sold an anarchist cookbook, FBI knocked on your door.
Oh yeah,
Right.
Early on, though.
Yeah.
And they just, who cares?
Well, and Buckley with his, that's always, all the first thing you hear now if you go to some of these conspiracy lists is, well, that's a false flag operation.
Right, exactly.
Everything is a false flag operation. Within 24 hours, you're going to see that posted somewhere. But a lot of these really are disputed cases. What are we seeing? What are the people, for example, the people that are, ISIS is putting out information now. We see that Inspire publication.
Yeah.
If you go to Inspire, does that automatically bring you to the attention of the government, do you assume?
Well, an interesting thing about Inspire is that the editor of that magazine, when it came out and it had those the pressure cooker bomb in it, that was Samir Khan, and he was killed in a drone strike against Anwar alAwlaki. Now, the government says that he was collateral damage, that they hadn't intentionally targeted him. If they had, they would have been targeting the editor of a publication that they didn't like. He was an American citizen. So this is a rather frightening case, I think. We don't entirely know. The government has released a white page about this drone assassination of an American citizen, but to me it's troubling. That's a troubling case.
It was also a follow-up drone strike where they killed his 15-year-old son.
Yeah,
who
exactly.
was clearly also not only an American citizen, but raised in this country. And,
and I'm not sure
was
how I
quite
feel about it. I don't really want Anwar alAwlaki promoting shoe bombings on planes, and but it's troubling in its constitutional implications, and we don't know enough, I don't think, of what
What was the hardest thing you had to do when you were writing this book? I mean, other than get it done, and it's always the most difficult thing, right?
Yeah. The hardest thing I had to do?
Yeah.
Read the stuff.
Okay. Court cases.
Legalese?
No, actually, the manuals themselves.
Oh, the manuals.
Themselves, yeah. You command a bit of science, which I wasn't used to as well. So to see if I had to kind of know if they would work, if the stuff would work. So I investigated that a bit.
Did you talk to any experts?
I did, and early on, and this was right after 9/11, and I asked. I met an explosives expert, and I had never actually set off an explosive device. I didn't.
Doesn't everybody?
I said, hey, could
My hometown they did.
Since you have a license, would you just take me on and show me? And he said, no.
Oh, really?
Not after 911.
Oh,
he wasn't
probably.
going to show anybody.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. What did you learn about the McVeigh case? Because that was an extraordinarily sophisticated. We had when I was working with that critical incident group, we had an explosive expert who talked about. I mean, that was racing fuel. That was a very sophisticated, huge bomb.
Yeah, it was.
Where did they get their information?
Yeah, that's a good question. The government introduced a book called CR4, which was by a guy named Ragnar Benson, and they claim that McVeigh had made his bomb from that. But the explosive that book describes was not what McVeigh used. I don't really know how McVeigh learned.
It does make you wonder.
Yeah.
It was so sophisticated. I mean, there was a lot of talk post that incident that he was actually part of a much larger group and that it was never really pursued.
It was complex because it had a two-stage detonation and it had
And the willingness to drive something like that to the site and go over speed bumps.
and he hand-lit the fuse.
Yes. Wow, that was...
That
It's
was really
amazing it worked.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very unfortunate that it worked. There were so many ways that it might not have.
Horrible.
I know,
Yeah.
unbelievable.
I mean, and
Now if you
Yeah.
buy that much fertilizer, you're on somebody's watch list.
yes. Yeah, you can't get that kind of fertilizer. And in fact, if you remember the Times Square bomber who tried the same kind of bomb, but he used the wrong kind of fertilizer, so thankfully.
Now we're able to use Taggants in explosives
Yes.
as well, aren't we? And how does that work? You put
Well, I
in-
certainly would extol the use of Taggants rather than trying to suppress the information or attempt
That
to
seems to
suppress
make
the
more sense,
information.
doesn't it?
Yeah, but putting Taggants in various kinds of substances makes good sense because it sends a message that you can get caught.
Did you end up talking to people who worked in various bomb squads? The guy next door to me was the Michigan State Police bomb squad expert. For
Yeah,
many years.
I did have one informant on a bomb squad.
Did you?
Yeah.
They're kind of an interesting group.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, they are. And frightening. I mean, they're not frightening, but I mean, it's frightening work.
Absolutely.
It's very, very, very frightening work.
Did you talk to any member of the Weather Underground?
Well, yes. I talked to Bill Ayers, but I couldn't get much out of him.
He probably
Yeah.
would like to stay out of it. Certain things are
Anyone
probably...
else you won't want to name?
Yes.
So,
That's always an interesting question when you're a researcher. Are you doing this as a journalist or as a researcher? Because I'm not sure how much you get to keep certain things quiet. Yes.
Yeah. Although I
Keep your
have to say
sources
that
private.
after the townhouse explosion, they really decided that they weren't going to try to do any kind of murderous devices or.
well, they made
They
some
had some
devices
kind
that
of
didn't
ethical-
work too, like the
yeah.
one in Detroit precinct.
Yeah, they didn't actually know what they were
It was the
doing.
only one that actually killed
Thank
someone was the University of Wisconsin, right? Where the
Right.
white
Yes,
researcher went back
yes.
in.
And he
They'd been
he used
warned.
an agricultural manual, an official one. That's, yeah. He went to a library somewhere and got his information. Carl Armstrong.
He owns a bar.
Does he?
Yeah, he owns a bar right on Main Street.
Really?
One of the things that the Critical
Go figure.
Incident Group did at Michigan State was trying to facilitate conversations between the militias and the FBI to avoid another Waco, because clearly the Waco and Ruby Ridge incidents were such that, but underground groups have really gravitated towards these kinds of devices. The information is freely out there. Should we be worried that with all this agitation going on in the Middle East, urging lone wolves here to pick up the mantle, should we be worried that we're in for it for another spate of these kinds of...
Well, there was a really interesting case involving the Hutari here in Michigan.
Yes.
They had an informant and an FBI agent in that group, so they were charged under that. They were charged with seditious conspiracy and also with that law I mentioned on teaching explosive devices, and they did seem to want to start a revolution of small groups that would gather together. At least they talked about it, but talking is not doing. And the Hutari, they were exonerated of all charges except a couple of weapons charges.
So much of what we see sometimes looks perilously close to entrapment.
Yeah.
Where, in order to have enough statistics to justify suppressing materials, it seems the government is willing to try to entice people into making statements or getting themselves involved in things that are chargeable offenses.
Yeah, well, the FBI certainly wouldn't call it entrapment, but it kind of looks that way from here.
Well, my assumption is because they sure wanted to throw the book at the Hutari, that if they were unable to do
did.
so,
They did.
it had to have been a little too close.
And when's your book come out?
In the spring,
Spring.
next year.
And what was the title again?
It's called The Wrong Hands, Popular Weapons Manuals and Their Historic Challenges to a Democratic Society.
Indeed.
Wow.
Great title.
Yeah.
It is.
Sounds like something Bill Ayers would have written.
I'll call him.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I hope you'll come back again when the book is on the shelf so people can learn more about this, because I think we're about to be tested again, don't you, Bill?
I think so. Now, you said you had a chapter in there on rockets, right, though?
Oh, yeah. Rocket science. Okay.
Nice. So
I'll
you
tell
should
you if
get
it's
together.
accurate. Yeah,